And I will give the floor to our last keynote speaker, which is Sarah Bestang Dekdeken. I hope I pronounced it right. Sarah, are you there?
Yes.
Okay, I couldn't see you. Welcome. And you are the Secretary General of Cordillera People's Alliance from the Philippines. I'm talking about the Philippines. I'm talking about environmental rights defenders, indigenous rights defenders. I think the case of the Philippines, you are also one of the authors of the book about the horrible situation, the harassment, the violence that indigenous peoples in the Philippines are facing. And I hope you can give us this information from the ground of the situation in the Philippines and how indigenous peoples are coping with that situation and how somehow the international community also can support you in your struggle. Thank you very much, Sarah. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lola, and good evening to everyone from my part of the world, the Philippines. I'm going to share here some photos. Just to wait. Anyway, can we just do that? Okay. So yeah, so I'll talk briefly on the situation of indigenous peoples in the Philippines since last year, and especially at this time of the COVID-19 pandemic. Actually, the situation here in the Philippines of indigenous peoples is not really far from what is happening in indigenous territories in other parts of the world, and especially Asia, at this time of the COVID-19 pandemic. So what you see in the slide, I'm sure that you all know that last year, Global Witness declared the Philippines as the world's deadliest country for environmental defenders. 30 deaths were recorded in the year before that, in 2018. And I'm also sure that you've heard about our president and wanted to say that during his term, since 2016, both human rights violations and the onslaught of destructive mining projects and dam projects have intensified, especially this year, despite the COVID-19 pandemic. So one of this is the Kaliwa Dam project. This is funded by China, and the dam project is located in indigenous peoples' territory. If it will push through, the Kaliwa Dam will displace 1,400 families, and it will also affect 100,000 more people. It will cause massive damages to the environment and then the biodiversity. And this is why there is a very strong opposition against the dam. The problem is our president is hell-bent in pursuing the dam project. And in fact, he said he would use extraordinary measures to ensure that the project will push through. So that is actually one of the highlight campaigns of indigenous peoples in the Philippines at the moment since last year. There are other China-funded projects that are located in indigenous lands, and people are opposing these projects because they are destructive to the environment. And then I'm sure it may also the case in other countries. It's because of the onerous loan agreements that we are against these projects. Because in these agreements, it says that if the country will not be able to pay the debts, then China can get a portion of our patrimonial assets that is commercial or that may be profitable for the Chinese. The attacks against indigenous peoples who are opposed to these destructive projects are escalating. So last year in 2019, the government implemented the president's executive order to end the local communist armed conflict in the country. So this has intensified the attacks against indigenous peoples precisely because this executive order targets activists and legitimate people's organizations and indigenous human rights defenders that are vocally criticizing government policies and programs, such as these so-called development projects, mining and dam projects. We are being tagged or labeled as communists, terrorists, and members of the revolutionary group in the Philippines. And unfortunately, this is giving state security forces a justification to conduct surveillance and violations of human rights like harassment, other threats, intimidation, and even extrajudicial killing. Last year, in August, one of our colleagues, his name is Brandon Lee. He is a Chinese American who was shot in front of his house. It was a frustrated extrajudicial killing. Brandon himself says that it was perpetrated by the Philippine military because they have been talking to him, but they did not succeed in stopping him from working with indigenous peoples, especially the farmers in Ifugao province. He has been a volunteer in our organization since 2010, and now he is back in the US and is recovering. And now that we are being attacked once more, Brandon keeps on issuing his own statements to expose these attacks against us. So that's on the frustrated extrajudicial killing of Brandon. There are others who were extrajudicially killed in the Philippines last year or since the start of the presidency of Duterte. In another region of the country, indigenous peoples and advocates have been barricading the open pit mining operations of Oceana Gold, a multinational company. So what you see in the photo, that's the open pit mining operations of the company. And the indigenous peoples did not want a renewal of the contract for the project because it just means another 25 years of suffering from the ill effects of mining. They succeeded in pushing for the suspension of the project last year. But since it's just a temporary suspension, the people did not leave the barricade even until now at this time of COVID-19. So despite the threats of the virus. But the photo on your right, that was taken on April 8th of this year. It was on that day that more than 100 members of the Philippine National Police violently dispersed the barricade. And it has caused injuries to some of those barricading the entrance to the mining site. Of course, this was widely condemned, especially because it happened at a time when there was a strict lockdown to prevent the spread of the COVID-19 virus. And this is also where we can see that the government's crackdown against environment and human rights defenders are continuing amid the COVID-19 pandemic. This year, the lockdown or community quarantine started in March 17. And indigenous peoples are among those that are most affected by the quarantine. Many of us, especially the informal workers and the farmers, are no longer earning income and are going hungry. Across the country, and there's an estimated number of 15 million indigenous peoples, we are not only exposed to the threats of contracting the virus, but we are very much affected by government neglect of humanitarian and health services as marginalized peoples ever since. No? We are experiencing hunger because the government's food relief is barely enough to survive for us to survive, and many of us have not received the government's cash aid. But the worst is that many are experiencing various forms of human rights violations because sadly the government has taken advantage of this pandemic to advance policies and actions that are harmful, especially to environment defenders and human rights defenders and indigenous peoples advocates. Last month on April 2, the president gave the military and police an order to shoot to kill so-called troublemakers. But this stemmed from a people's protest calling for food relief from the government. And this order of the president is very dangerous because it is prone to different interpretations. And also at the moment, this executive order of the president to end local communist armed conflict is continues to be implemented in various parts of the country in indigenous territories in the midst of the global 19 pandemic. And it is, of course, with the goal of silencing legitimate political dissent, silencing our voices against destructive projects like minings and dam projects. As part of implementing this order, the military and the police have been spreading disinformation against us. So myself, the chairperson of our organization, and our other colleagues, the attacks have intensified at this time of the COVID-19 pandemic. There have been plenty of death threats, and what is worse is that they have included our families in these threats against us. This disinformation campaign of the military and police against us started when we criticized the dropping of government propaganda leaflets by 2 helicopters in indigenous communities. Our criticism at the time was that the government funds should have been used to provide the much needed food relief. So what is more dangerous is that this disinformation campaign has caused some civilians or ordinary people to curse us, and some of them were part of those who have been sending us threats to our lives and security. So what this means is that those who are doing this disinformation, basically the military and the police, are giving the impression to the people that it is okay to hurt us because we are terrorists and communists. And so if anything happens to us, then they could just point to some civilians and they could get away with it. There are many other cases. There are also instances of arrests based on fabricated charges. And one of the persons arrested was the leader of the barricade against the open pit mining operations. To help our fellow indigenous peoples, we have launched relief operations since the start of the lockdown, that is on the last week of March. But even our relief operations are being maligned by the military and police. They are saying that we are corrupting the donations for relief. So you see, they are using all dirty tactics just to try to destroy our organizations and destroy the credibility of the leaders of our organization. These are some examples of the posts that have been circulated in Facebook, how they are trying to demonize us, to portray us as terrorists. And these have been widely circulated by the Philippine National Police Facebook accounts, as well as that of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. So a few weeks ago, we launched an appeal for support against the attacks to our organization and our leaders, the individuals and their families. We also launched an online petition. That is what you are seeing now on your screen. And we are hoping to gather more support and solidarity from the international community in order to help pressure the Philippine government to investigate on the human rights violations in the country, on the attacks against us, and to put an end to all these attacks. I've seen a question of Shankar Limbu of Nepal. How can global efforts be made collectively in order to address this situation that we are facing right now? I think that it's very important for all of us, indigenous peoples elsewhere in the world, and also advocates of indigenous peoples' rights, advocates of human rights, to come together and be strong and support each one. And it is very good that there is a book called The Indigenous World, where we get to know information of what is happening in various parts of the world. And also, in some cases, we get to know how to support them. There ends my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And yeah, you brought us to a very, very sad reality of Indigenous peoples in the Philippines and the enormous threat and violence that you are facing by your government. I think that it's not only in the Philippines, it's happening in many other parts, and there are Indigenous peoples from other countries in the world that are raising the same issue on how some of the governments they are using it to impose some totalitarian and repressive measures towards Indigenous peoples and to encroach also land of Indigenous peoples. On top of the marginalization and on the issue and the neglect of providing services and the lack of access of Indigenous peoples due to their historical marginalization